Governor Quinn rolled out two big plans for reform, but lawmakers are still working on their own ideas. That's up next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Charlie Wheeler, longtime Statehouse reporter and director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS. Charlie, thanks for being here.
It's always good to be here, Jamey.
And Drew Thomason, Statehouse reporter with Illinois Statehouse News. Drew, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Well, we saw Governor Quinn roll out his plans for reforming the state's Medicaid and pension systems. Lawmakers were working on plans of their own, but Quinn said that they were maybe dragging their feet a little too much, and he went ahead and presented his ideas. We're going to start off talking about the Medicaid proposal. Quinn was hoping to reduce the state's liability for Medicaid spending for next year by $2.7 billion. It's a pretty big task. Drew, we've talked a little bit about how difficult it actually is to tackle this goal. Can you give us a little background on what his options are?
Yeah, well, his options really are limited because of the national health care reform. So under that, you're not allowed to change eligibility for anyone who's currently enrolled in the system. Basically, you can't say, you know, we're going to change our eligibility to 100% of the federal poverty level to basically kick people off the rolls, which is the quickest way and the, some might say the easiest way to save money and save a lot of money. So without that option, what they have to do is they have to find what they term efficiencies, or they have to find waste, fraud and abuse to eliminate, which, you know, that's not going to close near that $2.7 billion gap. So then what they have to go to is to either cutting the rate for which providers get reimbursed for providing Medicaid services, which we're already fairly low on that list, and then they also have to cut optional services. A lot of people don't realize that what we provide in Medicaid is optional. Prescription pills are actually an option that states can or cannot provide, and that the Senior RX is one of the programs they've targeted for cutting. Glasses. Right now, if you're in Medicaid, you can get an unlimited number of eyeglasses per year. That's another place that they're cutting. So they've got a list of 58 different either cuts or reductions to kind of help make up that gap.
So Quinn's proposing kind of a mix of all of these things. He's proposing a cut to the services that folks can get. He's proposing a reduction in rates to providers, and he's also proposing a $1 a pack cigarette tax increase. Charlie, how does this compare to other efforts that you've seen to scale back the Medicaid program?
Well, I think this is a more comprehensive and a larger scale effort to reform Medicaid. But back in the 90s, when Governor Edgar was first inaugurated and he faced a similar problem, although not of the magnitude that we currently have, he did some of those same things. He, for example, stopped providing dental care to adults, chiropractic care, podiatric care, and made other changes, eliminated some people altogether from coverage in an effort to try and bring things back under control, and it, by and large, worked pretty successfully. And then as the economy improved in the later 90s, these services were restored. The difficulty that we have now is that there is really big difference of opinion on what should be done. By and large, Republicans have said they will not be for a cigarette tax increase, even though in the past, when it was a Republican governor proposing a cigarette tax increase, some of them supported it. But now, no tax increase. So if you take that off the board, that's more than $600 million between what the cigarette tax would raise and the federal matching funds. They're also more opposed to cutting provider rates than Democrats. On the other hand, Democrats are much more strongly against limiting services to people or reducing, in essence, throwing people off the rolls by saying this program that covers you, we're going to eliminate the program altogether. Drew mentioned the Illinois Cares RX. That's basically for senior citizens, and that's maybe the only Medicaid program many of them participate in. If you eliminate that program, there's more than 100,000 seniors who would no longer be part of the Medicaid system. And so you have these differing opinions within the party caucuses, and it's going to be unpleasant and difficult however it occurs. And then there's people who argue, well, if you would just go and get rid of all the people who aren't entitled to Medicaid, we could solve the problem that way. Now, I don't personally think that that would do it, but that's another option out there. So this is going to be, I think, an argument that's going to go on until the end of the spring session, maybe even into the summer. And I'm not really sure how it's all going to come down.
And you're already seeing a lot of pushback from kind of the groups that would be affected. Yesterday, the Illinois Hospital Association and the Campaign for Better Healthcare came out with a report saying if you institute these cuts, there's going to be, or I guess savings, that some of them are cuts, that not all of them. You're going to see 25,000 jobs endangered, $3.2 billion in economic activity lost. And I've got some figures here from the last fiscal year. The top Medicaid claimant was Carle Hospital in Champaign-Urbana, and they billed the state for $2.4 billion in Medicaid claims. So you're talking about a lot of money that hospitals get from the Medicaid service. A lot of their income comes from the state. So they're going to be pushing back against that rate cut really hard. And it's something that they've, I believe last spring, Governor Quinn called for a rate cut, and we saw the hospitals come out then and push back really hard, and they were able to kind of quash that. So like Charlie said, this is going to be something that we're not going to not hear for the next 6 weeks.
Yeah, and in fact, as Drew was mentioning, last year, you'll remember this too, Quinn said, we'll cut the rate 6%. And I believe it was one of the chambers said, well, we can't do 6, we'll do 3, and the other chamber says, we ain't going to do any. And the provider group said, in essence, don't cut our rates, just take longer to pay us. I mean, already it takes almost forever for you to pay us. Well, let's wait and we'll take forever for you to pay us, but don't cut our rates. Because in many cases, the rates are lower than what other states pay for similar services, and in some cases, they're actually lower than the cost to provide the service by the hospital or the doctor's office or the pharmacy or whatever.
Just a little context to that. Someone in the governor's office told me that the rate cut would equal to about a 7 or 9% cut across the board. So we're talking even higher than last year, though she said that it's not going to be applied across the board. Some hospitals, like I think the safety net hospitals, they might see a smaller increase or smaller rate cut. The general practice doctors might avoid one altogether. All that's still being worked out.
Yeah, and the thing is, if you cut hospital rates, hospitals still have to take people. They can't turn them away. Under federal law, anybody who comes in and is presented in an emergency medical condition, the hospital has to take care of that person. Doctors don't have to do that. Dentists don't have to do that. And so if you cut provider rates, a provider must just say, hey, I'm not going to bother with Medicaid clients. And then where do these people go for their care? And there's also a long-term impact if you eliminate certain services where you may wind up paying more in the future. If you eliminate adult dental services, for example, and somebody has a cavity and they can't get the cavity filled, and it goes on and it festers, and now it's an impacted, infected tooth that has to be removed, and maybe they go to the hospital emergency room, and maybe there's someone with dental expertise who can do it, maybe there's not, and they just give them medication and send them home for a couple days, then the person comes back. So the costs are going to be there. Thankfully, we're not a society that is going to say to people, you have no insurance coverage, you're no longer in the Medicaid program, you just lie in the gutter and die. We're not doing that yet. And so the care is going to be given. The question is, does the state pay up front, or do we pay in the back end, and in some cases more?
Well, and with the healthcare industry being one of the few industries that's seeing a lot of job growth in the last few years, is it a real concern for lawmakers that they might stymie what little recovery we've seen in Illinois as far as cutting so much to hospitals and providers? Charlie, do you think that's a consideration, or? I
think that's another factor that's got to be looked at. I don't know the methodology behind the study that Drew mentioned, the Family Institute. I know that institute, and it released its information in conjunction with the Campaign for Better Healthcare, which is a group that for decades has been working in Illinois for universal health care coverage. And so they are more on the side of providing more health care. But the methodology seems to suggest that when you reduce the rates, there will be layoffs, people will lose their jobs, and there'll be ripple effect throughout the economy. And it's kind of the same argument that's being made to keep open state prisons or state mental facilities where the governor's proposed closing. That if you do this, it will be devastating to our local economy. And in the case of the Medicaid, it's not so much a local economy as it'll be devastating to this industry across this whole state.
Well, and then there's another caveat to this. The Illinois House has passed a resolution that basically says if they can't reach this goal, then cuts will come from other areas of spending such as public safety, education, other areas that are very popular areas of spending. Charlie, do you think this will be the thing that pushes the legislature to get this done, or do you think they'll hold to that resolution in the end?
Well, based on the experience of last year when they enacted a similar resolution and there were pressures for additional spending during the course of, I guess, the spring and in the summer, what happened when the legislature came back in the fall, they did provide for the additional spending, but they cut elsewhere so that they stayed within the bottom line of the resolution. So I think that'll be the case again this time, although some of the advocate groups are arguing we should make some changes in our revenue structure that would bring in more money. We should sweep some of the special funds that are out there, for example, or we should delay the impact of the tax relief that we provided for the mercantile exchange and other people, last winter. Maybe delay it for 6 months, or maybe we should start to tax some services. So there are people out there concerned about the impact of the cuts who are arguing we need to enhance our revenues. But as things stand now, I don't see a lot of support for that. You guys are there on the scene every day. You know better than I. And I don't think the legislature is going to go beyond that number that they have, which I believe is $33.7 billion that we can spend. Here is $18 billion that we've already put away for pensions and debt service, group employee health insurance, and other kind of unavoidable expenses. And that leaves us basically $16 billion for everything else.
Well, and lawmakers are also looking at trying to reform the pension system sometime this year, which we'll touch on that in a little bit. But Drew, you mentioned something interesting earlier today about how while these big reforms are going on, large budget cuts are also having to happen, and they're not getting a lot of attention yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the number, but I'm pretty sure in Pat Quinn's introduced budget, there is less spending on general services that the state provides. And so, in a normal legislative year, if that happened, that would be splashed across the headlines. You and me and Charlie would be writing his column on this, and we would be focusing on where these cuts are coming from, who it's affecting, all that. Those stories have kind of flown under the radar this year because Medicaid and pensions are such a huge deal, and because they impact the budget in such a big way. I mean, Medicaid, the cost of Medicaid, and not just health care in the state, that's a bigger cost, but the cost for Medicaid is $6.6 billion. That's $6 billion out of the $16 billion that Charlie mentioned. I mean, that is a huge chunk of the pie. So if they can't deal with that, they say, it doesn't matter what we do with the rest of the budget. Everyone's kind of taken to calling this the squeeze. Medicaid and pensions are squeezing everything out. Yeah, that is definitely seems to be the case, but what they're squeezing out really has kind of flown beneath the radar so far.
And it probably won't be clear until the last days of session what those things will be that are getting squeezed out. But I'd like to move on to pensions now. Governor Pat Quinn also released his recommendation on pension reform. He called last week the Epic Week for Epic Reforms. He was waiting on lawmakers to bring forth their ideas, but the group that was working on pension reform couldn't reach a consensus. So again, Governor Quinn came out with his own proposal. It involves what he considers a trade-off for employees. They would have to opt into a system with lower benefits, they would retire later, have to pay more, or they would have to give up subsidized health care and cost of living increases that are guaranteed. Charlie, you're kind of our pension expert. Can you give us a rundown on what Quinn is proposing and what your thoughts are on it? I'm guessing you're going to say it's unconstitutional, as a lot of people feel that it is.
I'm not sure if it is, and the reason is because of the way this is being presented. But you're right. The basic gist of it is you're going to have to pay more, work longer, and get less. And what he's proposed is raising the retirement age to 67 generally, with exceptions for certain categories. I think, for example, policemen and firefighters. You wouldn't necessarily want some 67-year-old firefighter climbing up the ladder with the hose. He's going to increase by 3 percentage points the contribution that employees make to their pension system. In my case as a university employee, and in your case, we pay 8% of our salary into the pension system. Under Quinn's plan, that would go up to 11%. And it would be the same increase for employees across the board. All public school teachers outside Chicago, all state employees. Then there would also be a change in how the cost of living is calculated. Currently, every year you get a 3% increase in your cost of living, and it's based on what your pension was the year before. Quinn wants to change that to 3% or half the rate of inflation, whichever is less, and he wants to calculate that based on your initial pension, so that whatever COLA you get in a particular year doesn't get added to the base, and so you're not compounding your pension amount. And another element that's out there that's not as, what would you say, has not been as well received is the notion that public school districts, universities should pay out of their own budgets more of the costs of their workers' pensions. The state basically picks up the tab for them now, except public schools in Chicago. And there's feeling that, well, in the case of universities, they should pay it out of, I guess, tuition money. And local schools, they should pay it out of property taxes. And so that's kind of the parameters. Now, as you know, as we all know, there's a provision in the Constitution that says membership in a public employee retirement system is a contractual relationship, and it cannot be diminished or impaired. But the catch here is that Quinn and others who are supporting this idea say, well, we can't unilaterally come in and say to you, we're going to cut your pension. On the other hand, since it's a contractual relation between us and you, we can ask you, would you like to give up some of these benefits? Would you like to work longer? Would you like to pay more? And if you say sure, then it's not a problem. And to kind of nudge you along to saying sure, we're going to say, if you don't say sure, you don't get any health insurance, and none of your future pay raises will count toward the base of your pension. And so because it's being offered as an option and not being imposed, that gets around the constitutional language, a lot of people, including myself, think. Then the next question is this a free will choice? If I put a gun to Drew's head and say, give me your wallet, he can choose to give me the wallet or not. But there's sort of a coercive element of the gun, and he may say, well, I think I'll just give you my wallet. And so if this were to pass and I were a lawyer arguing against it, I'd point out that what kind of a free choice is it when you tell someone you can either take less pension or you don't get health insurance?
Well, and we do have to do our little disclaimer here. All of us sitting at this table do stand to potentially benefit from the pension system. Charlie and I are both university employees, and Drew, as my husband, could possibly benefit in the future from the system as well. But we'd like to think that we can be objective enough to deal with that. So, Charlie, you touched on
what... Yeah, and in fact, in my case, it really wouldn't impact me that much because I'm already past 67, so...
Charlie, you touched on what is one of the big sticking points in the legislature between what Quinn would like to see happen and what some folks maybe wouldn't like to see happen, which is the cost shift of some of the pension systems onto local school districts and onto universities. Drew, can you kind of explain why this is an issue? Especially downstate Republicans are not big fans of this idea.
Well, what they're saying, what downstate Republicans equate this to is a property tax increase, because as Charlie pointed out, right now schools pay a pittance for the teacher retirement, but they're the ones who set the contracts. It's the local school boards who set salaries. Downstate Republicans and school districts are saying, if you pass this cost on to us, the money's either going to come out of the classroom or it's going to come out of increasing your property tax rates. And the Republicans are staunchly against that. I think they would like to see they'd like to see the teachers pay more into the system rather than see a property tax increase.
Well, let's go ahead and move on to the next topic. We will be revisiting pensions often, I'm sure, in the coming weeks. But this morning, the House Investigative Committee that's looking into charges against Representative Derek Smith held another hearing. They're not really making a lot of progress. They're a little stymied by a lack of evidence. Drew, can you give us a rundown of kind of what happened this morning? First, let us know why they're meeting and what their goal is, and what happened today.
Sure. So, freshman Representative Derek Smith, Chicago Democrat, was arrested for allegedly taking a $7,000 bribe to try and steer a state contract to a fictional daycare that the FBI and Patrick Fitzgerald, the U.S. Attorney, set up. And so, beyond those federal charges, the House has started its own hearing and its own investigation to see whether they should discipline Representative Smith, kick him out, what they should do with him. At their last meeting, their first meeting, they asked Patrick Fitzgerald to please give us all the evidence that you have collected so far so we can use it in determining what our next step is. He sent this letter back to them, and he basically, in a very polite way, says no. This is an ongoing investigation. Giving you the evidence that we are going to use against Mr. Smith will compromise the investigation. We're not going to do that. And so now we're at a little bit of a standstill. Smith is set to enter a plea on April 30th. I believe that's Monday, of either guilty or not guilty. We're still not sure which way he'll go. I talked with his lawyer today, asked him that question. Of course, he said no comment on that. So what the House is planning to do, this Special Investigative Committee, is basically request Smith appear and testify before them. Whether they do that through a letter or a subpoena, they're still not sure yet. Apparently, it doesn't matter either way. He can just say no, as is his constitutional right. Unlike in a criminal court, however, though, if he says no, the House committee can hold that against him. You know, if I'm in a criminal court and they call me to testify and I say I plead the fifth, you're not supposed to hold that against that person. Elaine Nekritz is the chair of this committee. She said that under the current law, if he says no or declines to show up, they can hold that against him when deciding how to come down on disciplining him, if they discipline him at all.
Well, and the U.S. attorneys not only won't share evidence, but they also ask that the committee not really poke around in what their evidence is. So really their only option right now is waiting to see what comes out of court filings or getting Smith to talk himself. Charlie, I mean, what are the chances that he'll actually come? And this is sort of an interesting conundrum that they don't have a lot of evidence to deal with this, but clearly they'd like to deal with it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think if I were his attorney, I would advise him not to show up. And I don't know what the committee really can do. I suppose legally and technically the committee could decide to throw him out because they don't like the way he spells his name. The standards are really not spelled out. It's just in the judgment of the House can discipline its members for whatever the House thinks the member has done that makes the House look bad. It's not like, as Drew was saying, it's not like where there's a criminal trial where there's certain standards and certain procedures to follow. So they could go ahead and do that. My guess is they probably won't do anything, and they'll say, we'd like to delve into this, but Patrick Fitzgerald says don't, because you might mess up what I got going. And we are just going to kind of hold back and see how the criminal proceeding plays out and then act accordingly after that. I still think the pressure will be put on Derek Smith from behind the scenes to maybe cut a deal with the U.S. Attorney and say, yeah, I goofed up, I'm sorry, and to show how repentant I am, I'm going to resign from the legislature. I won't be a candidate in November, and let's see what kind of a deal we can work. I mean, if I were his lawyer, assuming that the evidence is as strong as what has been reported, I'd probably advise him to kind of cut that kind of a deal.
If you look in the U.S. Attorney handbook that they give all new U.S. attorneys, that's actually an option that they lay out for people in office. They say, part of the plea bargain can be for them to either step down from office or to quit running in the race, and that's really the only bargaining chip he has at this point. So I mean, he's been around the Capitol a few days. I've seen him in committees. He's there, I think, kind of putting on face. So if it comes down to, like Charlie said, his lawyer says, you know, let's cut a deal, he'll have that chip at least.
Well, there was one other kind of big news story that happened this week that came out of an audit of the state's workers' compensation program. Charlie, we've only got about a couple minutes left, but can you give us just a rundown of what some of the findings were in this audit that were fairly controversial that came out of the workers' compensation system?
Yeah, and basically what the auditor found was the system is pretty well screwed up. I mean, that's the short and sweet.
Is that what he said?
He didn't say in quite those words, yeah. but he said that the system gives out money to injured workers too readily. There's not always medical evidence to back it up. Sometimes they make awards that people don't even ask for. And it also suggests that part of the problem is that we're using computers that are, maybe older than some of the people on this panel. Not myself included, obviously, and they're understaffed. For example, the adjusters, the people who actually figure out these claims, have caseloads of about 1,500 according to Bill Holland. Kind of the industry standard is 250. And so there's just a lot of things that are going wrong, and he suggests that there be changes made administratively, some changes made in the law. There were some reforms enacted in the wake of this last year, but he's saying that more needs to be done.
Well, and as we see the state budget cut and we see personnel numbers go down, we're seeing this as a pattern. The FOID card system ran into some trouble. It's kind of similar findings. I mean, Charlie, is this something that we're going to see happening over and over again as agencies see their head counts go down?
Yeah, that's a problem. When an agency has a mission to do and it doesn't have enough people to do it, you're going to get audit findings like this. And this has been an ongoing problem for some agencies where the legislature tells them do X, Y, and Z and only gives them enough money to do X. And then the auditor dings them and says, the law says you're supposed to do Y and Z. And the department says, hey, we'd love to. Find us the bodies.
Well, and we're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests for joining us today, Charlie Wheeler and Drew Thomason. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine. Check out our Facebook page at Capitol View Politics and tune in next week for Capitol View.